Story 1. Had a patient come into the emergency room with a makeshift bandage on his shin. He had fallen on rocks while hiking and left a 3-inch long, half-inch deep gash in his leg. I go to pull the bandage off, and as I'm peeling it away, I notice the skin is completely black, and there are dark chunks of fungus falling out of the wound. It looked necrotic, like it had been left alone for a week. I look at this guy like he's crazy as he tells me the wound is only a few hours old. He's pretty proud as he explains that he created a makeshift poultice by chewing up leaves and moss, mixing it with river mud, and stuffing it into his leg. That's what all the black mossy stuff was. Don't do this. Story 2. My grandfather grew up in poverty less than 100 years ago. He got a tapeworm as a child, compounding his skeletal weight. An old wives' tale Sally down the street told my great-grandma was that if she dangled a carrot down his throat, the tapeworm would come up, bite the tip, and she'd be able to pull it out. Story 3. Blowing cigarette smoke in a child's ear to soothe an earache. Letting a dog lick your wounds to prevent infection. Packing a scrape with mud or dirt. Putting vodka or gin into the baby's bottle when it was teething. I heard this from my English friend. Cutting off warts with a sharp knife. My father did this to me when I was 4. It hurt a lot and bled heavily, but it didn't return. Story 4. Growing up in Florida, I was always told to go swim in the ocean if you have an open wound or cut. The salt water will cleanse and disinfect the wound. Now you can't go in the water if you have an open wound out of fear of infection or flesh-eating bacteria. Story 5. You know rest, ice, compression, elevation for sprains and strains? Turns out it was based on faulty data. The person who originally popularized rest, ice, compression, elevation has now spent most of their career trying to undo the dogma. But there isn't a catchy phrase for, you can use ice initially for initial pain relief, but then you should transition to gentle heat, do gentle stretching and movement or exercise as soon as you're able, and don't elevate or compress the injury in lieu of gentle exercise and movement, which will help more with healing. Story 6. I remember hearing beauty experts tout coconut oil as the secret to healthy hair and skin about 10 years ago. Even then, I always cringed at it because my mom always put coconut oil in my hair when I was little to try to make my hair neat and my scalp less dry, a traditional method in my family's culture. I hated that because it smelled and didn't do anything except make my hair feel gross. So I felt vindicated when dermatologists started advising against using coconut oil because it clogs your pores. Story 7. Did you know that Coke used to have cocaine? It is one of the most overshared pieces of trivia ever, but nobody talks about how 7-Up had medically significant amounts of lithium and was advertised with that as a selling point until 1948. Story 8. Appalachian here and mountain medicine is full of this stuff. For baby's colic, you could administer a rolled-up spider's web. For cough syrup, my mother would dissolve a Christmas-sized candy cane into bourbon. Oh wait, I still like that one. Update. When I woke up this morning, in no way was I expecting these comments to absolutely make my day. Plus, I am learning a lot. Hugs and kisses. Story 9. Back when I was a kid in the 1970s, the old-timers in my neck of the Delmarva Peninsula would swear by using old, nearly white, completely dried-out dog poop as a remedy for toothaches and cavities. Specifically, you would find the oldest, driest piece possible and pack a piece of it into the cavity or affected area of the tooth. Even as a kid, that did not resonate with me, and to this day I am proud to report that I have never had dog poop in my mouth. Story 10. My dad was raised by his grandparents. When he was a newborn in the early 50s, his grandma would soothe his gums when he was teething with whiskey. She would rub a little on his gums and put a tiny bit in his bottle. She tried to do the same to me in 1974, and my mom almost had a stroke. Story 11. The use of mercury to treat various diseases, including syphilis. Also, bloodletting, which was considered a universal method for treating almost any disease, now looks extremely ridiculous and dangerous. Story 12. My grandma, who was 12 in 1930, would make homemade cough syrup whenever I was sick as a kid. It included a handful of elderberries, a handful of blackberries, a handful of blueberries or pawpaws if she had them, boiled with a handful of peppermints. She would strain it into a mason jar half full of moonshine. I can't remember coughing after drinking it, so I guess it worked. Haha. Story 13. My dad is one of the crazies who believes in it. He tried to convince me to use it on anything skin-related, from bug bites to a staph infection. Story 14. The idea of letting your wounds air out has now been convincingly shown to make it worse by accelerating moisture loss and contributing to excessive scarring. Scabs were great when we had nothing else, but it's no longer the olden times, so put a dressing on it. Story 15. Cutting off long hair to preserve strength, especially if one had a fever. Shaving a patch of hair on top of the head bald and applying a piece of brown paper soaked in oil to the spot to cure a cough. This practice was from the late 18th century to early 19th century, but no one knows how long people continued doing it. People seem to think there was a lot going on with hair growth and too much of it could be a problem, especially if you were a woman. Early police officers used to carry a vial of smelling salts with them on their beats to help revive people who fainted on the street. It was standard issue equipment like a baton. Story 16. I'm in my mid-40s. When my peers and I were babies in the late 1970s to early 1980s, it seemed fairly common among various European-influenced cultures to give upset or teething babies a rag dipped in heavily diluted spirits to calm them. My spouse, who is Polish, got vodka. I, being Canadian and British Caribbean, got brandy. Two of my Irish friends got whiskey. It was also somewhat common up until the early 1980s for doctors to suggest a pint of Guinness regularly to expecting mothers in the final trimester. Up until the early 1990s, Guinness was also suggested for menstrual cramps. This would not happen today, obviously. Story 17. My grandmother, born in the early 1900s, believed that if you peed on a leaf and tied it around a broken bone, it would heal the bone. No, I do not understand how one would come to this conclusion either. Story 18. Cocaine. Laudanum. Bleeding and purgatives. Putting butter or grease on burns. Using petroleum jelly or essential oils to smother ticks and make them release. It does make them release, but it also makes them regurgitate, which increases your risk of contracting anything they were carrying. Story 19. Ivermectin for COVID. People were clearing out their local veterinary hospitals and farm supply stores of an antiparasitic and using it like an antiviral. Can you imagine? Story 20. When my sister and I would get sick, my Korean mom would tie a string on our finger and prick the tip with a needle, then push the bad blood out. I hated it so much, especially since I knew it was nonsense at a young age, and my American dad let it happen. Story 21. Paregoric wasn't a folk medicine, but an actual over-the-counter medicine used by everyone, including children. It contained morphine and other ingredients, like anise oil, camphor, and benzoic acid. Story 22. My grandmother believed you could bring a pimple to a head by holding beef fat on it. Then again, she also believed any stitch you sewed on Sunday you would pick out with your nose in hell. Story 23. Parapekini, or rebaking infants, involves covering a sick infant in a special dough and leaving them in a preheated and then cooled oven. This practice was common among Russian peasants prior to the fall of the monarchy. Story 24. All this reading and I'm coming back to the conclusion that the United States desperately needs socialized healthcare. Your Appalachian folk medicine doesn't work. Tammy. You need to see a real doctor. Story 25. My siblings love their red light therapy wand. The instruction manual shows the light can be used to cure a wide range of maladies from migraines and depression to intestinal issues and warts. Story 26. People still do it. Do not urinate on jellyfish stings. Urine is not sterile and can even cause the nematocysts that are not active to fire, causing more damage. Use hot water or vinegar. Even rinsing in the salt water is better than peeing on your sting. Story 27. Rubbing honey on wounds and properly bandaging them was a good way to prevent infection. Honey has antibacterial properties and can prevent infection while not rotting. Story 28. I heard that my grandfather babysat me when I was an infant and filled a clean handkerchief with sugar and soaked it in bourbon to help me sleep, just like he did with my dad when he was a baby. Story 29. We called my great-grandmother the potato witch. Got a sore throat? Eat a raw potato. Got a stone bruise on your foot? Rub a raw potato on it. Got warts? Rub a raw potato on it. Wrap that potato in an old dish rag and bury it during a new moon. Story 30. When I was a little kid in middle school, my mom bought these books called Firefox, which is a collection of remedies from Appalachia. I remember the one that disgusted me the most was a remedy for worms. The method called for the patient not to eat for a few days, then take a glass of milk, and the worms would be attracted to the smell and eventually come up to and out of the nose. Story 31. I have a friend who got a big gash from falling off of a mountain bike and no medical kit, so they decided to rub some dirt in it because they had heard that in their childhood. When they finally did get back to their hostel, it was super infected. Story 32. Veterinarian here. One case that stands out the most is from one of my friends who does a lot of work with the Amish. She went out to see a horse with gastrointestinal upset. We always do a rectal exam in such cases, as it is an extremely useful diagnostic tool, especially in the field. Normally, you'll pull out manure and sometimes, unfortunately, you feel distended intestines, which is not good. That day, she pulled out an onion, a fully intact, undigested onion. She was told it is an Amish remedy for colic. I joked that maybe it makes the colon cry and rehydrates a dry impaction, in which case, the joke's on me because I've been making this way harder than it has to be. Story 33. Use a black cat's tail to swipe across your eye if you have a stye or pink eye. Chewing tobacco on a bee sting. Peroxide on cuts. Drying out a healing burn, instead of allowing it to heal wet on wet or putting mustard or milk on the burn immediately after. The effective remedy to minimize scarring for burns with wet on wet healing is a hydrocolloid bandage and rinsing with lukewarm water for 10 minutes immediately after the burn occurs. Also wanted to add, chickenpox parties. Story 34. The antimony pill was a metal pill made from antimony that you swallowed, supposedly to clean you out. Your family would sift through your stool to find and recover it to be used again and again. That's some nasty stuff, but it must have worked somewhat, or why all the trouble? Story 35. I worked in a nursing home that had assisted living. Basically, you got your meals, laundry, and medications, but you could come and go. We had a woman who woke up one day, fell out of bed, and had a stroke. It was said she was never going to walk again. We didn't have a nursing bed open, so they put her in her own assisted living room until one opened up. Her granddaughter stayed with her. She had her cook fresh potatoes every day with lots of butter and salt. She wrapped her legs in hot mashed potatoes and hot wet towels every day and night for 2 weeks. She started to walk after the 16th day and walked until she died 4 years later. True story. Story 36. I always think about how George Washington was treated when questions like this come up. I can't wait for the day we can look back and say, they what? Poison people to cure cancer? What a bunch of idiots. Story 37. Essential oils for everything. I will grant you that some scents and some oils can have soothing properties, and some can be a valid part of complementary medicine, but one needs to really question when multi-level marketing companies get involved. Story 38. It seems so wild to me that not so long ago, and I think still, parents would just send their kids over to someone's house to spend the night when they had chickenpox. I mean, I know why. It just seems wild how recently that's been. Story 39. Bloodletting. Treating everything from fever to infections and even mental illness. Doctors used leeches or cut veins to drain blood, believing that it would balance bodily humors. This practice often weakened patients further and worsened outcomes. Story 40. My aunt used to babysit me, and whenever I'd bump my forehead, she'd rub the spot with toothpaste and stick a penny on it. I've never met anyone else with a similar experience and still have no idea what possessed her to do it. Story 41. 1970s Australia. My dad grew up on a farm. The country remedy for a bad sunburn was to rub white vinegar on it. Of course, being kids, we were always out in the sun during summer. It hurt like a terrible pain. Story 42. When I was a kid and had ear infections, my mom would make a hot onion poultice to put on it. I casually mentioned this to my wife once when she kind of freaked out and told me my mom is insane. She is. Story 43. Depends on how long ago we are talking, but in the American Civil War, poison ivy was used to close battle wounds. In a sense, I am sure this did work because the swelling would increase and could help close up open wounds. On the other hand, I would rather just get my leg cut off, thanks.